Hi there. I'm now extemporizing an introduction which we're going to script and make a standard introduction for these podcasts, these videos, and MP3s. And it's going to go like this. In these interviews, in these discussions, the theme really is paying attention. The theme is the way we can look at our world in ways that are maybe slightly different to the way in which others are looking at the world, the way in which we've been persuaded to look at the world, and we'll be trying to show what we can turn up. Doing that, we'll be trying to get insights into problems that we have with a view to trying to come up with ideas to deal with those problems, to improve the world, if you like. So that's my intro. And it's sort of ambitious, but it's just about talking and thinking together. And I've been excited by some of these conversations because they're not, we haven't worked out exactly what we're going to say. And quite often, in my case anyway, particularly the second one, where we talked about paying attention in politics, I sort of did some thinking for myself during the conversation, and so that's kind of exciting. So there you are. That's that when I script this, it'll be a lot shorter and a lot punchier, but that's what it is right now. And here's my cup of green tea.
I'm Peyton Bowman, and today we're going to talk about knowledge and its enemies. So this is based off of a script that you sent me for a video that you're working on. And my first, reaction to reading this would be, who's an enemy of knowledge? I mean, why would knowledge have any enemies?
Yeah, so let's get going talking about that, except that you've embarrassed me by introducing yourself, and I don't think I introduced myself. My name's Nicholas Gruen. I won't say any more. Anyway, so how could knowledge have enemies? Well, the script begins with Socrates, and Socrates certainly thought that knowledge has enemies. And one of the enemies Socrates thought, one of the most fundamental enemies of knowledge in Socrates' view was vanity. Vanity is our overestimation of ourselves, our preoccupation with ourselves, and so on. And so there's an enemy of knowledge. And it occurs to me, and we can talk a bit more about that, but it occurs to me that often great breakthroughs, if you like, great new eras in knowledge come with people becoming aware of all sorts of ways they're going about thinking that are wrong. And so I'm reminded of Francis Bacon, the 17th century philosopher of science, possibly the most, the most fundamental philosopher of science at the very beginning of the scientific revolution, starts talking about he starts getting incredibly excited to the point of megalomania about what human beings might be able to do with science, how it might enable them to address their, what we now look upon as poverty, how it might make them incredibly powerful and rich in the world and happy in the world. And one of his main, an important agenda for him is what he called idols of the mind. We may have talked about this previously, but these are, and today, it's a bit of a dumbing down, but we think of cognitive biases as a similar sort of thing. So I think just to kind of end this response to your question, an enemy there are lots of ways in which we might go off the track in seeking knowledge. But if you throw in Socrates and also Francis Bacon, there's this idea of human psychology and, in a sense, morals and ethics, that sends us off the track, because it's really much more fun to big note ourselves. It's really much more fun to pretend that we know stuff that we don't. It's much more fun internally, and it's much more fun socially to try and get other people to think how brilliantly clever we are. I better stop there, or I'll just go on and on.
So, well, it's an interesting question. So this idea of there's knowledge, and then there's this kind of expertise, or this being an expert, and it's interesting how. Well, first of all, how do you define someone who's really an expert in a topic versus someone who's just they know about it, or they know something about it? And, of course, I think of this Dunning-Kruger effect, where when you first learn about something new, you get very confident in your knowledge. And then as you learn more, your confidence declines. And then little by little, as you get more and more knowledge, you start to build up to a higher level of confidence in the subject again. And I do sometimes think, in a way, I think a good example of where we're at with this right now is in this cryptocurrency space. I think a lot of people, they start suddenly learn a little bit about cryptocurrency, for example.
That's right.
And they get really excited about it.
Yeah.
And they feel like very knowledgeable about it. But cryptocurrencies and NFTs in this related space is very confusing and very deep topic.
Yeah.
So,
but you can pass yourself. You can kind of join the adults. You can start talking as if you know a great deal more than you do.
Exactly, and there's almost this mass. It's an interesting phenomenon because there's so many people at that beginner stage in what's actually a very complicated topic right now. So I think that's really driving the enthusiasm. Yeah.
Well, that's driving the enthusiasm. It's also driving all the money that will be removed from the suckers, one thinks, at least over time. That's absolutely right. Why would I be making and explain a video about this? Well, I've been making, as you know, I'm in the business of making a bunch of explainer videos, but there is just to get back to this idea of practice. So to try and get back to this idea of trying to really put our finger on problems with a view to trying to do something about them. So here's a proposition for you, Peyton, which is that expertise ought to be conceived of as two things, not one. And the expertise needs to be a knowledge of a thing, and it needs to be accompanied by an understanding of and a candor about, an honesty about, a searching honesty about how internally you don't kid yourself about how much you know. In other words, about the knowledge and the limits to that knowledge. And that has an individual dimension, which is to do with our own vanity. And it's always very tempting to think we know more. And it has a social dimension. And the social dimension is that if I'm posing as an expert, let's say I'm a back surgeon, I really shouldn't just be there talking to you who've come to me and said, should I have back surgery? I shouldn't just be thinking, by God, have I got a bit of back surgery for you? I'm a bloody good back surgeon. I should be saying to you something like, well, you ought to know that back surgery is not like knee surgery, for instance, or getting your appendix out. It's not one of the more success. There are some people who probably should have back surgery, but lots of people regret having back surgery. I think, based on this methodology, I think you've got a 20% chance of it making it worse, a 60% chance of making it a lot better, and a 20% chance of being about the same. And I hope that's added up to 100, but I wouldn't guarantee it. But that's not how expertise is. That is not how expertise is dispensed. Expertise is dispensed as a performance. And it goes much more to how much expertise a person has, what they know, than it goes to the limits of that knowledge. And that's true in pretty much all of the high status professions. And maybe we can explore some of those a bit. Because I want to leave as a sort of kicker that there are professions where this is not the case. And that's going to be in the next explainer video. but we'll maybe bring that in our conversation here. So what are you going to do with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's. I think that's that boundary between kind of knowledge and what you know, and what you know you don't know.
Yep.
As a mark of expert, as being an expert, is really interesting one, and one that it's to some degree described in this Dunning-Kruger, the curve where you're at the end of the curve, you start to kind of climb a little bit, but you know that there's a lot of stuff in the field that you may or may not know a lot about.
Yeah. And
it kind of goes back again to this figure of Socrates, who you talk about in this video. So as the story goes, he was told he's the wisest person in the world, and he had this revelation that the reason that was the case was because he knew, at the very least, that he didn't know anything. Right? And so he took it on himself in a way to, I like how you describe expertise as a performance. He took it on himself in a way to expose the performance aspect of
to perform his ignorance rather than to perform his knowledge. Yeah. And in fact, it's sort of wrong to say he knew nothing. It's a little more prosaic, a little more normal and commonsensical to say he knew how little he knew. And there are certainly plenty of people, I will include myself in this, without making any very grand claims to wisdom, that as you learn more, you just understand how little you know. That is just a kind of long-run, lifelong Dunning-Kruger effect. So that to me, and so Socrates is performing his ignorance rather than his knowledge. Well, see, there you are. I hadn't thought of that. That's a nice way to think about this. Yeah. He's performing his ignorance and not his knowledge, and then he's exposing the ignorance of others. Because what he does is of course, we all say this is irony, and when I was younger, I wasn't sure it was irony. I suppose it's certainly, there's plenty of irony there. Whether it's all irony, I don't know. But he says, "Oh well, you're such a clever person. You'll be able to tell me this," and they gradually out themselves as someone without the foggiest clue with about what they're saying.
Well, it's clearly, and this use of the word performance is so right on, because it's clearly he was performing a kind of act, right? To show himself as ignorant, and it's what made him to people so annoying, right?
Yeah.
People really didn't like talking to him.
Yeah.
For this reason.
Well, that's Plato's idea.
Yeah, in Plato's version.
That's Plato's propaganda. He strikes me when I read the Apology, he strikes me, which is his speech before the assembly. He strikes me as really extraordinarily aggressive. So I just wonder how sympathetic a character he was. Anyway, sorry, you go on, Pete.
I mean, in that speech, he gives such an outrageous. I mean, he makes such an outrageous proposition towards the end that not only is he shouldn't be punished, he should be given this lifetime meals in the. It's been a long time since I did, but this was a place where the war heroes would basically have their meals. There was a kind of eating club for the war heroes, and it's the highest honor you could possibly have, and so I think that's what he asked for. In a way, so. It's a form of aggression. I mean, his way of using irony was aggressive.
Yeah.
But
he does. I mean, maybe I've read quite a few of these dialogues, and it was decades ago, and that maybe you've read them all, and it was decades ago. But he's very charming, at least superficially, most of the time. Are there times when he basically concludes in a fairly matter-of-fact way, "Look, it seems pretty obvious you don't know what you're talking about"? I think he doesn't do that.
No, well, so in what's kind of there were the four dialogues that people think were written first. There was the Apology, the Phaedo, the Urethra.
Yeah. Well, they're here. I've got them here. I'm holding them up to the microphone.
Yeah.
They are the urethra, the euthyphro, euthyphro, the apology, crito, and phyto.
Yeah. So, and those dialogues were written fairly early on, and at least we believe in Plato's career. So, in that he presents this version of Socrates, which he uses his form of inquiry, this halenchus, to kind of destroy arguments.
Yeah.
And we talked about this in another one of our talks. In other dialogues, we start to see an attempt to create a more of a positive philosophy using the same mechanism. So, the Meno is a good example of this. And even to some degree, some of his more famous works, like the Republic, is an attempt to construct, using this kind of conversational strategy, a positive philosophy. It's not quite so negative and quite so caustic, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But that strikes me as being very much Plato's, desire to make something more of what Socrates was doing. That feels
or his
Socrates.
decision to use Socrates as the mouthpiece for Platonism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, Plato was one of the students of Socrates, and I think they shared a certain perspective. I mean, so Socrates, in some ways, has a kind of anti-democratic.
Yeah. They share that.
Plato is an aristocrat, so they have this idea of society should be run by people who are knowledgeable or people who have special characteristics.
Yeah.
But it is worth noting that there are different visions of different visions of Socrates.
Yeah.
So we have, for example, an account by Xenophon, who wrote a couple dialogues about using Socrates. And also, even Aristophanes wrote a comic play about Socrates called
the Clouds. Yeah, he also, I think he also turns up in the Frogs, doesn't he? Not that I know what the play is.
I don't believe he's in the Frogs.
I ran into him.
I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of contemporary figures who show up in the Frogs.
Right.
But I think it's more. But in any case, so there's a sense in which we don't really know, but Socrates himself may have been a kind of a genre sort of figure, like a kind of like Sherlock Holmes. Anyone could sort of take this character and use him. And there may have been a lot of literary production using this Socrates character. We don't really know.
Yeah.
And in the past, of course, because of the influence of Plato, it was taken for granted that Plato was writing the real version of Socrates, and that Xenophon sort of understood about Socrates, but because his version is fairly close, so it's a little bit different. And excuse me one second. And that Aristophanes was just making fun of him because he writes comic plays and these comedies, and didn't like Socrates for whatever reason. But now there's a sense in which it could be the case that Socrates was more like one of your average sophists that he seems to criticize in Plato's dialogues, and that he was more that kind of figure, and that was a particularly successful one, and that's why Aristophanes wrote about him in that way. And in that play, he acts a lot like your typical sophist, right? So he has that approach where he makes up these arguments that confound the truth, and they're just ridiculous.
They're silly.
And,
and
this is in Plato's version. This is exactly the kind of thing that Socrates is fighting against. But
and I've always struck. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to interpolate. It sort of struck me that you kind of swallow this idea that Socrates and Plato were philosophers and they're sort of fighting the sophists. But what are sophists? Sophists are people who sell their services talking about philosophy and other things. And that's roughly what that's roughly what Socrates is doing. He's just not selling it because he's well enough set up not to have to sell it.
Yeah, they made their money teaching rhetoric to rich young men who wanted to have political careers. And so, and the more sophisticated you could make your arguments, and the more that you were able to demonstrate things that were clearly untrue through your arguments, the more people wanted to learn from you because it showed that you were very good at doing what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's that was the basic idea, and what.
Well, that's Plato's idea of what a sophist is.
Well, it is sort of what the sophist was. I mean, that's in at the time. So
yeah, but these guys have pretensions to someone like Protagoras and so on. I don't know whether he's a sophist, but these people have pretensions to having real knowledge, just like in some senses Socrates does.
Well, I do think so. I mean, there was a sense in which they were. That's actually a very interesting question, because one thing they were trying to do was obviously show that they had knowledge, but another thing that they were also engaged in doing was attacking the foundations of knowledge, in the sense that they believed, in the same way you had this concept floating around, let's say, which you read about in Thucydides, about in this Delian dialogue, where if a nation is more powerful than another nation, does might make right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. So it doesn't. This more powerful nation can do what they want to a less powerful nation, because they're stronger, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this sense in which you have this idea of excellence, right? So, what's more excellent? Well, the more powerful nation is more excellent in some sense than the less powerful nation, and at least in the sense that matters, which leads to political domination.
Yeah,
and it's a tension that goes back to Homer. So in Homer, you have this. At the end of the Iliad, you have this race between, as part of the funeral games for Hector, and there are two people racing, and one is really clearly the superior runner, and then the other one is less fast, slower, to use a technical term. So they're running, and the faster guy slips in this blood that's on the ground, and he falls down, and then the slower guy wins. And so, in terms of that race, how do you define the excellence? Well, is it who actually won the race?
Yeah.
Or is who's actually the faster runner?
Yeah.
Because the outcome was different.
Yeah.
And so, in this kind of 5th century
an early credentialing issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So in this 5th century, world where people are on the one hand arguing that if a nation's or a city-state is just stronger than another city-state, they should just be able to attack and dominate it. At the same time, you had this kind of counterpoint in the world of rhetoric, where people are saying, well, if you can argue something, even if your argument is clearly false,
you win the day.
The most famous example is that there was, I think it was Gorgias from Syracuse. I might be getting this name wrong.
Yeah.
But he made a speech about how Helen of Troy was a very virtuous and good woman, which to his listeners was a clearly false proposition. But he makes the argument in a very eloquent and persuasive way, and this is what made him very attractive as a sophist. It made him an attractive person. People wanted to learn from him because they wanted to learn how to make these arguments that could dominate their opponents. And this was important not only because, in the political world, it's important to be persuasive, but in the legal world, the way in which the Greek court system worked, we're used to courts, presenting evidence and, trying to determine what the truth was using these kind of third-party forensic tools. But back then, there was nothing like that. It was just people made arguments, they would make a speech, and then you would have someone show up as a kind of witness. But the witness wouldn't say, "Oh, I was there and I saw this." They would say, "This person is a very good person, and they know what they're talking about, and so you should listen to him."
Yeah.
It was more this kind of character witness.
Yeah, yeah.
So to be able to be persuasive in that kind of venue would literally mean, or not, it would lead to, let's say, positive outcomes in court cases. So it was a very valuable skill.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, it's sort of been swimming around in my head for a while that the Greek democracy ignites precisely the same kinds of things that we see around our own democracy, which is driving us completely mad. It's clearly a kind of major part of the, if you like, the knowledge infrastructure. All this rhetoric. And then, of course, I come from a background which I've got certain bees in my bonnet about how we use science as the paradigm of knowledge as opposed to a paradigm of knowledge, and other kinds of knowledge like practical knowledge, practical wisdom, were taught as part of the rhetoric. Was seen as part of rhetoric more than as part of dialectic, which was anyway. That's, I don't think so I'm a bit conflicted, but certainly we see the downside of rhetoric today, the domination of politics with emotional, sensational appeals to various unconscious drives, a bit like vanity.
Well, I think it's interesting because expertise certainly plays a role in this. You have, especially if it's acquired in an institution that people value. So if someone says, "Well, I have a Harvard MBA," and then they go work for a consulting firm, and then they go work on let's say a call center or something. Like how to improve the call center, and they have general knowledge on how to conduct and run business and lots of things. And I'm not here but their expertise in this particular area is kind of, it's not demonstrated by anything besides the fact that they're associated with an institution.
And there are whole structures. I mean, the public service is very similar. So an MBA is a kind of generalist degree for someone in the private sector, and in the public sector, you might start off as a lawyer or an economist or arts or fine art, God knows. You then end up in the public service, and you typically, certainly in Australia, I think this is probably less true in Europe, but in Australia and in lots of English-speaking bureaucracies, what you really want to be is a generalist. And then you just kind of get moved around. And if you're an economist, they'll put you in charge of the Department of Health, because we all know that we want the health system to be economical. It's a joke. It's terrible. And in fact, I think relevant here is my experience as the first chairman of a company called Kaggle, which was subsequently bought by Google. And what it does is it crowdsources data science. So just to make it, I can explain this pretty clearly, which is that, let's say you've got a bank. A bank will have a statistical model of what things in an application for a loan are predictors of failure, of predictors of default. And so what we would do is we would say to them, well, give us, look at 400,000 cases and give us a pile of, and so what we will do is we will release we'll anonymize them firstly, and then we'll release 200,000 of these, which will be the training data, and people will train models which predict default on these 200,000 cases, and then you, the competitor, send us the model and we'll run it on the test data, the other 200,000. and somebody will be the best possible performer, and they will have built the best model. Extremely rigorous. Now, a number of things occurred. One of the things was that all of the people who won, I think they were all men. I don't want to draw any particular conclusions from that. They were all in. They were all aged just under, or they were all aged between late 20s and under 40. Some of them were doing PhDs. Not one of them was a lecturer, was a professor of statistics or data science or any of that stuff. And the other interesting thing was that if you won one of these competitions, it didn't qualify you all that much for the next competition because there were lots of different ways to, different bits of data rewarded different kinds of insights and techniques. Now, I mean, that's a very striking result because, and what I could see fairly quickly is that winning a competition on Kaggle would be a far better thing on your CV for anyone who's trying to pick a good data scientist than some certificate from a university. So it's now, and now, of course, people fell in love with this and said, well, can we do it with lawyers and millions of other things? And the answer is not nearly as easily. But it's nevertheless, it's actually kind of a performance credential, because if you've won a competition, what you know is that no one in the world, at least anyone, you get a prize for doing this, and lots of people try and win the competitions. Nobody in the world was better than you at that problem. No such thing. No such thing for a credential from Harvard or Oxford or some little local institute. So it's a very different way to. It sort of gives you new eyes to see this idea of expertise and so on.
Yeah, I think it's well, and of course, I think Plato's project and Plato's Socrates was to push back against that idea that you could just pretend to be an expert and to pretend to have knowledge and to make a very nice sounding argument.
That's right.
But it is an interesting. The example you talked about really, I think, opens up a door to another interesting conversation about how people are, let's say, included within the body of, let's say, experts or decision or policy making. And I know that. And it kind of speaks to one of your other major topics, which is how we can use, let's say, jury selection or kind of random selection to how to make bodies that organize or choose policy or govern. I don't know if we have all the time to get into that, but perhaps we can wrap up today by just talking a little bit about how what's kind of the answer in our kind of like some sense of how can we respond to, let's say, this overconfidence?
Yeah. Well,
among these experts in the public sphere today.
Yeah. So I won't give you be able to say, oh, just do this and it'll all be fixed.
Right.
But I started our conversation saying there was this profession that gives forecasts. And, of course, I realized when I was telling you the story of Kaggle that Kaggle is actually a class of forecasts. Now, if you think about, let's go through this case. Somebody wins the forecast because they say that their model gives you the best measurement of the odds of default of every single customer. Now, what is the measurement? Now, this is a key idea, and it might be a great thing to conclude on. I might say, Peyton, he's this age, he's got this background, he's got a 2% chance of defaulting. Well, that's a claim, which is Peyton very, very probably won't default. And it's a measure of my ignorance, which is as a 2%. If you take it as a prediction that he won't default, it's a 2%. It's a forecast that I'm 2% likely to be wrong. So that's a beautiful hack for what I call Socratic expertise, which is the expertise together with a measure of of the limits of that expertise. And the profession I was thinking of at the beginning of that I referenced at the beginning of our conversation is a lowly profession, not surgery, not an economist, not a military analyst. All of these people, not a company director. All of these people are famous for their overconfidence. A weather forecaster. And what does a weather forecaster do? They say there will be a 30% chance of rain. So I've made a prediction that there won't be rain, and I'm telling you, I'm 30% likely to be wrong. And that's a crisp example of Socratic expertise and something we can take into further discussions about how do we build on that, because it's not perfect and it's perfect here, but there are other domains we want to go into, and you can't do it in other domains, like a surgeon. You can get them to quote chances and so on, but there's a lot more to it than that in lots of areas.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. Well, I think that is a good stopping place, and I would be interested in exploring that a bit more next time. I think there's a lot to be said. But thank you very much, and it was great having this talk today.
Thanks, Peyton. And I've still got plenty of green tea to go on. See ya.
See ya. Bye.